Bienvenidos a esta sesión del seminario Cuerpo, Salud, Religión, organizada en esta ocasión de manera conjunta con el seminario interno del Departamento de Estudios Sociales del Colegio de la Frontera Norte. El día de hoy tenemos el gusto de contar con la presencia del profesor Steve Sussman, quien presentará la conferencia Spirituality in Addiction Treatment. Voy a presentar brevemente al profesor Sussman en español, pero como saben, la conferencia va a ser en inglés. De cualquier forma, si después de la conferencia quieren hacer preguntas o comentarios, pueden intervenir en español y aquí Ietza podrá traducirle a Steve sus preguntas y comentarios. Entonces, bueno, el profesor Sussman es doctor en psicología clínica y social, Clinical Behavioral Farm, ¿sí es?
Preventive medicine, psychology, and social work.
Ok, y trabajo social.
I graduated in social and clinical psychology.
Ajá. Social and Clinical Psychology en la Universidad de Illinois en Chicago. Actualmente es profesor de Medicina Preventiva y Psicología en la Universidad del Sur de California. Está interesado en el tema de las adicciones definidas ampliamente y en la traducción de programas de su prevención y cesación y cese. Bueno. Ha publicado más de 430 artículos, capítulos, resúmenes y libros en este campo. Es editor de la revista Evaluation and Health Professions desde 2010 y es editor asociado en otras 5 revistas. Además fue premiado por la American Academy of Health Behavior en 2005, donde fungió como presidente en años pasados. Entonces, bueno, vamos a darle la palabra al profesor Sussman y después tendremos tiempo para hacer un poco de diálogo, preguntas, etc. Please.
Primero, first, how many people here speak some English? Is everyone? Yes.
Everybody.
Okay, so you can say, if I speak to, you can say hablas más despacio, Steve, and be okay.
I'm sorry, Steve. I also want to say, estamos transmitiendo por internet. Then perhaps someone else is following you through internet. So we may have then some questions through social.
Okay, so well, to start out, it's always good to start out informally. So I'd like to introduce you. Here's my family, and no, that's not it. Okay. People use the word spirituality a lot in recovery. In there's a whole recovery movement, which is international, but the strongest it has the strongest foothold in the United States, and then and there are some countries where it's much weaker foothold, but very very strong there, and it's my interest in spirituality is in part because it's kind of like a placeholder. For those of you familiar, I guess let me, I'll take this from very much the academic research perspective. We speak in words, and the words we speak are often, the meaning of the words are often by the context that we use them in. Sometimes words are placeholders, and we put different things into the same word at different periods of time. And so, for example, even yesterday, and I was very impressed to have the opportunity of going to La Esperanza, and believe that they're doing good things there. But also, when the question is asked, have you taken Christ into your heart? Then you have to go ahead and define. And this will seem maybe weird. It's what do you mean by Christ? And what do you what do you mean by taking Christ into your heart? So there's still a sense of like at least Karl Popper and the logical positivists would argue, how do you operationalize? How do you, and it's in what that means, it depends on really how it's used. And that means, so how should one behave to demonstrate, or what should one say to demonstrate that they have done those things? And so that's kind of where my interest came in. So in the United States, if anyone has ever gone to a 12-step meeting of any kind, they'll, in the steps, they'll talk about, they'll say this is a spiritual program. And then if you say, what do you mean by a spiritual program? It'll also be, well, a lot of times it'll be turning your will and your life over to the care of a higher power. And the question will be, what higher power? And it could be various different types of higher powers. And in a sense, especially, and here's where I get confused, a person who's brand new in recovery is very vulnerable in certain ways. I mean, they can be very street smart, but they're also very vulnerable. They're looking for something to help them stop and stay stopped. And so they almost have to put their trust into someone, but it'll be, but it's in a sense they almost would have to put their trust into someone tells them, this is what you have to put your trust into. So it can be, in a sense, it can be kind of scary, frightening. But anyway, okay, let me, so the contents of this talk, is, first to ask the question, what is spirituality, or what is usually meant by spirituality? And by the way, if there's any parts of this talk you already, are familiar with, I can speed up or slow down. So if you know this, let me, if it seems I can say go, do some other stuff, Steve. The second question that I asked, or my colleagues and I asked in this paper, is, and in some other papers that we've done, is what might mediate the relations between spirituality and recovery from substance use disorder. So it's basically looking at mediating variables. That if spirituality is a certain entity, and substance use is another entity, then what is it? How does spirituality act on substance use? Or at La Esperanza, you'd say, you take Christ into your heart, something then happens, and then you don't use substances anymore. What is it that happens? So one hypothesis would be is you have a major realignment of your experience and personality. Basically, you take out your street life and knowledge and everything you've known and you've done, and you plug in a whole other existence. You plug in that doesn't involve drug use, and it's that whole other existence, the whole package, that ends up leading the person not to use drugs, because they will tend not to be thinking that direction. But it has to be a major realignment, and then probably you need to keep the person out of that environment that they're familiar with. Because once they go back there, if they can plug in the old tapes, then they're at risk, unless they carry with them this whole new, unless they really strongly internalize this whole alternative package of existence. So, okay. Then the third question we ask is, what are non-spiritual or secular facets of addiction treatment? Because, if spirituality can mean any, that which means everything means nothing. If it's a bookmark for anything, there's no. So what are the where can we kind of draw down the boundaries? And then finally, how might one achieve further clarification of this construct? And that goes into a little bit into philosophy of science. So, okay. So I don't know. I just like looking at this photo, and there in the middle is just a dopamine molecule for fun. So okay, I'll go on, and there's some. I think somewhere in there is the nucleus accumbens and all that stuff. And the medial forebrain bundle has got to be in there. I don't know. All right. So what is usually meant by spirituality and spiritual experience? So I think that probably everyone here, you all know this. For Cass and colleagues, they talked about spirituality as being one's personal search for a connection with a higher power, and, as opposed to an organized religion. So the personal search for this higher power, the higher powers can be referred to as a God, or if you're very religious, you might put G-D so you don't say the name. And then it could be ground of being, or it could be life force. So it permits different ways to experience this higher power. A philosopher named Otto called it the mysterium tremendum. In the book The Idea of Holy, called it the mysterium tremendum, or the tremendous mystery, which is another way to kind of view this higher power. And then if you have all these different labels, it starts getting a little vague or ambiguous or unclear. And then you see each person has to find their own. What does that mean? You order something on the menu? I don't know. It gets confusing. But however, when a person does find this connection, when they make this connection to a higher power, the idea is that it leads to reduction of anxiety and a sense of belongingness with other beings. And that's, Cass said that, William James said that back in the early 1900s, and his lectures talked about the natural state of being for people was to kind of be ill at ease, and that when one finds a sense of through spiritual searches, when they find a sense of connectedness, they feel good about themselves and their life, which is the essence of what James would call spirituality. And so there'd be a reduction of anxiety, sense of belongingness with other beings. So part of this is also, they call the search for the sacred, and this refers to that which underlies existence. So they're thinking about fundamental ideas. Why are we here? Produces devotion, or a sense of a specialness or special qualities to that which underlies existence, and then somehow in that can permit a person at least to feel some kind of connection. Okay, there are people who have had problems with addictions, whether it be alcohol, drugs. Now, currently in the DSM-5, gambling finally entered in May of 2013, and there's a whole host of other things. I'm reading people are debating whether kleptomania. Kind of says kleptomania, so yeah, you see. So that whether that's an addiction or an OCD, but that's people, all sorts of things. They're kind of dealing extensive cosmetic surgery. Is that part of the same process? But anyways, if some people, when they go to, they'll go to a 12-step meeting, they really have a difficult time with the higher power, with the notion of higher power, or a God, or sometimes it's not just a God, it's your God. Sometimes it gets more specific, and there's a very specific conception, I guess, like at La Esperanza, about what, God is. They are more, it has to be more of a, I guess, Pentecostal related Christ, as opposed to possibly another perspective of Christ. So the person, if they reject either a godlike perspective of spirituality, or if they reject the whole notion of spirituality per se, there could be some difficulties. It does happen to be one is the person say, well, you just can't quit substance use. You can't quit your substance problem if you won't at least fake it till you make it, or buy into, gradually you'll internalize it. You'll be engaged in these conformity processes, and you'll get it. If you don't get it, you will not be able to quit substance misuse. A second thing is, okay, well, maybe you'll be able to quit your substance use problems, your alcohol, your drug use, but you won't get true sobriety. You'll be dry. You won't be a quality sobriety. You won't learn how to live feeling comfortable with yourself and with others. You'll still feel what you felt before you use substances. And so for people, anecdotally, I don't know if you're interested in substance abuse, what what people who have problems with substances will say sometimes is they always felt like they had a hole in their gut where the wind can blow through. Or they felt lonely when they were in a crowd. Or that they felt uncomfortable in their own skin. Or somehow just not quite fitting. And that substances in a way would provide a sense or certain appetitive satiations that would give them this kind of missing linkage in a sense. And that's what a lot of people will tend to say. And so people who are into this say, well, spirituality is that linkage. If you are not spiritual, you will go back to being dry. You'll gain substitute addictions. You won't get it. A third one is a person say, well, if you don't give into spirituality, you're not as deserving of the gift of sobriety. Because there could be the idea, well, if you're really spiritual, particularly like in 12-step programs, in the 12th step, the ideas a person is doing is helping other, in AA, they're helping other alcoholics and carrying their change self throughout all of their lives. They're essentially becoming conscientious towards other people, and they're becoming better persons. So if you're not going to buy a spiritual solution, then maybe you're not as good of a person in certain ways. And if you're not as good of a person, you don't really deserve that gift of sobriety or that gift of really being helped in certain ways. That's not officially in any program, but these are the level kind of persons and treatment among individuals, not official statements. The fourth is an idea where the World Health Organization and others has included spirituality as being a dimension of health. So therefore, if a person doesn't want a spiritual solution, arguing with the World Health Organization, you can say, well, you're not totally healthy because you're not buying into a spiritual solution. So it can be very difficult. Now, one of the first 10 founders of Alcoholics Anonymous was someone named Jim Thirlwell. And he was an atheist. Wasn't the most popular member of the first 10 in Alcoholics Anonymous. But he'd have arguments all the time. At first, his higher power was the group that he belonged to. And then he said later on it was the good part of himself, something inside of himself, his conscience, in a sense. But it was something in him, and which can anger many people in AA, because they say one thing about AA, it can't be me, it's something outside of myself. But for Jim Thirlwell, he said after he had a certain amount of sobriety, it was actually something in himself. Eventually what happened to him is he ran a group in San Diego, not far from here. And then the group may still exist, I'm not sure. And he died several years ago. There is in AA a group of people called the Quades. There's a couple groups. Quades means Alcoholics Anonymous for atheists and agnostics. The Quades is a very strong group in some cities and not others. There's also a group called We Agnostics. So there are groups that'll, so then the question becomes, okay, we got to go back and say, okay, what is spirituality? Part of what spirituality is may be how we measure it. So how do we measure spirituality? Well, one way to measure it is just to ask someone, how spiritual are you? Okay, so if I go around on a scale, if I were to go around in the room and let's do a scale from 0 to 10, how spiritual are you from 0 to 10?
0.
Okay. I'm sorry, well, take your best guess. We don't have a place on our questionnaire for I don't know. But if you had to put somewhere on the scale, where would you put it? And you don't have to respond, it's voluntary, You can say, I'll pass.
I don't know, I think I am a spiritual person, but I know in amounts.
Okay, if you had to put 0 to 10, what's the first number that pops to mind?
I think, I don't know. It's difficult to say.
Okay, you don't have to, okay. So with that, how would you, if it's an interview, you could write it down, and then you could say, well, it sounds, okay, I'll put down a 7 for her, because she says she's spiritual, but you can't put a number, so I'll put a 7 in between 5 and 10. And that's how we'd end up probably coding it. You left the room, and I've asked the question from 0 to 10, just as an illustration. How spiritual would you say you are as a person?
Myself?
Mm-hmm.
I'm a very spiritual person.
So 0 to 10. Whole numbers. What number would you? 4. Okay, so that's spiritual. So
I think 8 maybe.
8. Okay, 8.
I'm not a religious person, but I'm a spiritual person.
Okay.
20.
20.
No, 10, I think.
Okay. I'm thinking of the movie Spinal Tap for some reason, but I don't know if you ever. What volume is it on? It's 11. Yeah, but the volume only goes up to 10. You could just no, it's 11, man. It's 11. But okay, 20. Okay, 10. Yes.
Maybe 6 or 7.
Okay, 6 or 7.
6.
6.
3 or 4.
8.
Wow.
It depends the day, but
Okay. And since I'm giving the talk, I don't have to say anything.
What about you?
In Thai, Chamiru. In English, in Espanol, no sé. It depends on the moment during the day. Sometimes a 9 and sometimes a 0. And if I had to give one for a measure, but this talks about, trying to measure spiritual, it's a difficult construct to try to measure. I don't know. Last night I was an 8, probably. Right now I'm probably a 4, maybe 3. And there's times I'm definitely a 0, and there's times when I'm like a -2. The second thing is participation. One definition of spirituality could be participation in spiritual groups or events. And I'll speed. I know I should speed this up, but I'm kind of. Is it okay? I'm kind of going slower than I was going to go. But a second one is participation in spiritual groups or events. So you can define yourself as spiritual just if you go to regular church attendance. If you go to meetings of some kinds, like recovery meetings or spiritual groups of various sorts, like the Oxford groups, AA sprang out of the Oxford groups, which are essentially spiritual groups. If you, so I mean, there's a variety of different types of spiritual. Could be nature, people who are very much involved in nature and have a spiritual identification with going on hikes. They go on a weekly hike, that might be their spiritual group or event. But okay. Third is engagement in spiritual experiences such as meditation and prayer, or speaking in tongues, or trying to obtain solace from a higher power. Do any of you know anyone who tries to have conversations with God? Personal conversations. Anyone know anyone? So, well, for those, that may be one of the very positive aspects of spirituality in AA experience. And in another paper, we'll go into mediators, but it's possible. Here's an explanation. One part of your brain is talking to another part of your brain. And when the two parts of your brain are talking to each other, in a sense, you are trying to talk to God, which is the part of your brain associated with having a social conscience. And you're trying to meditate in prayer with two parts of your brain, your deliberate executive processing operations and your storage of social consciousness. And when the two parts of the brain are talking and the linkage is very strong, you're more likely to act in a sober way. That's a neuroscience perspective of what might be going on when someone is talking to God. It loses all the magic, doesn't it? But that's one quality of what. Okay, anyway. Fourth are the idea of subjective beliefs or feelings. And that's having just a sense of purpose. And this is more secular sounding, but spirituality, but it's sense of purpose, feeling peaceful, feeling a sense of harmony, having a sense of forgiveness. Like if you forgive me for this talk later, you'll know you're very spiritual. Having a sense of connectedness is all. Okay. Important. All right. So here, of course, is the prototypical mediation equation that people will use. Are you all familiar with this? No? Mm-hmm. How many are not familiar? Never seen it? Okay, 2. Okay, so I'd suggest you learn it as a basic, at least a basic idea. The idea is you've got one variable, which is your predictor, and it is related to your dependent variable. So in this case, your predictor, we call it spirituality, whatever that quality is. We've had 4 ways of trying to measure it. But this thing, spirituality, your dependent variable could be the quality of your life, or it could be, if you've had a substance use problem, it could be, your quality, your sobriety, being sober. And then you'd say there's C is that direct relationship. I'm spiritual, therefore I'm sober. And this is and the quality of my sobriety is determined by the degree of my spirituality, which is actually, the main effect model is somewhere there in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. They'll talk about, but that is a quantitative relation, actually. Okay, then you go and you can talk about mediating variables. And the idea is that your spirituality predicts something or makes something happen. One thing it could do, your spirituality could result in your one part of your brain talking to another part of your brain. Okay. Then that thing, that mediator variable, I gave you one example, one part of your brain talking to the other part of the brain, then predicting the quality of your sobriety. And so the second equation, so equation A is spirituality causing interconnections in the brain. Equation B is, we know that certain interconnections of the brain, when strengthened, causes one not to drink and use, or helps to protect one in high-risk situations, not to drink and use. And then equation C is spirituality predicting drug use. Now, if you plug 3 variables into the equation, if you go ahead and you add the brain strengthening connection variable, however you'd measure that, along with spirituality together, predicting substance misuse, the relationship, if you've got a mediation effect going on, the relationship between spirituality and sobriety will decrease. It may go down to 0. Full mediation means that the whole relationship between your independent variable and your dependent variable is accounted for by your mediator. In other words, the relationship between spirituality and recovery can be totally accounted for by something else. Or it could be partially accounted for by something else. Or if that other variable is a separate entity from spirituality. Does that make sense? And I mean, mediation can also become there's all sorts of complicated equations now. Which I won't go into. But, I mean, you could find situations, you could find, I have to say that, you could find situations where your independent variable is not at all related to your dependent variable, but you have a significant mediation effect. Because you have a positive, your A direct can be positively related. A could be, your independent variable to mediator can have a positive sign. Your mediator variable to dependent variable can have a negative sign. And then your C will appear to be 0. So you can have all sorts of weird things, but okay. So now I'm going to talk about 9 types of mediators that might operate. Whenever I'm teaching in a class and I talk about mediators, let me see how good your English is. I'll usually say, but you know, it's okay to be a vegetarian. And that was a little. You get it? You know, meat eater. Never mind. It's not funny. But I use it every year in my class. Okay. So, building a personal sense of morality could be one thing. Morality is acting in the right or good way, right? Versus acting in the wrong way. If you act in the wrong way, in theory, you experience guilt. I mean, initially you may feel pretty good, but sooner or later you would experience guilt, remorse, shame, so on. Religion in certain cultures serves as external controls or social norms, and so one idea is group-based prohibitions may explain the mediation effect. We did do a paper with alternative high school youth in Southern California. These are youth who don't fit into the mainstream. About 30% maybe substance use disorders. There's a whole, but they're not obtaining their credits in time to graduate high school. So they're like 17 years old. And we did find, it wasn't the best statistical model, but when we put in morality in there, how guilty would you feel, if you use drugs or whatever, we put that in, and you put in a spirituality measure, which encompass several types of spirituality. Spirituality predicted drug use. Once we plugged in feelings of guilt or morality about drug use, the relationship between spirituality and drug use fell to zero in the population. So one potential mediator is of a conscience, or basically feeling guilty of using drugs. So that's one possibility. Is one study. Another one is maybe spirituality builds a stable positive attitude. That positive attitudes towards life that encompasses, optimism, positive affect. People will say, don't feel upset with what you don't feel. Feel happy with what you have as part of the coping, kind of the recovery coping kinds of things. And, enjoying what you have in life is what's important. And that would be instilling an example of trying to instill positive attitudes. Religious institution or spiritual practices may help instill positive emotions. When we went to the church service, the recovery service the other day at Esperanza, and I don't know if I should. Well, it was fun, and I felt good afterwards speaking English, and so it produced positive emotions. And for some of the people there, it produced positive emotions. Not for everybody, but for a lot of people there, it was producing all sorts of emotions. But so one kind of mediating variable could be instilling positive emotions, and that emotional and behavioral experiences generated through positive attitudes may foster, life satisfaction. That could be a mediator. Third mediator is creating conscientiousness, the desire to be of assistance to others. They say humility is not thinking less about yourself, but thinking about yourself less. So it's the idea of it's not self-esteem, but it's the idea of thinking about others and there's the whole notion of being of service to others. You see that at Esperanza, you'll see that at 12-step programs, and you'll see that in some in Spain, they have cognitive behavioral recovery programs that are not very secular, but you'll still see the same kind of emphasis on conscientiousness and learning how to be helpful to others, so kind of socially responsible. Well, so an idea of subjective interconnectedness with all living things, a sense of meaning through feelings of love for people, or empathy or generosity. All these kinds of things are related to conscientiousness. And there's also a form of meditation that's called loving kindness meditation, where a person meditates and then they also add in this feelings of connectedness, and that's a spiritual activity, or could be a spiritual activity, and that creates an increased conscientiousness. Okay, next one is sense of coherence. Sense of coherence is from a theory of someone named Antonovsky. Is called the salutogenesis. It's related to, and I think to hardiness and other kind of wellness constructs in the wellness movement. There were three components of sense of coherence. And that one is that the world is understandable. So for those of you, how many in here, just a show of hands, feel that you understand the world? The world is understandable to you in general. Anyone? Okay. Okay. How many of you feel you have skills to cope with life demands through yourself or through people you know that they can? Okay. And third, how many of you feel there's aspects of your life worth committing to? You know, that you feel a commitment, yeah? Okay, so there's a fair amount of sense of coherence in this room. And we have a lot of sense of coherence over.
Hypercoherence.
Hyper sense of coherence, which is a good thing. According to Antonovsky, it's a very good thing. And it could be what happens when you're involved in spiritual, and you have spiritual experiences. It increases you might increase your sense of coherence, and then that increases your substance use. By the way, the implication of some of this is you could do things through secular or non-spiritual way to do the same. If you can manipulate the same mediators, if you can alter the same mediators, you could accomplish the same thing without talking about a higher power or God or or other kinds of entities. Would be the argument. One thing that people will say, it just popped up in Alcoholics Anonymous, they'll say, don't analyze, but utilize. So part of the thing is for some people, it's don't think about it. Don't do a mediation analysis, just use it. But for any of you, if you ever are involved in people in recovery who are thinkers or tend to think a lot, then you could try to create a 2x2 table. And you say it's okay for you to analyze as long as you also utilize. Because then you can analyze yes or no, utilize yes, no, and then both might be better than just utilizing. But unfortunately, most people, a lot of people in recovery don't think in those terms. They don't, and you can see there can be a disconnect. If you, in certain ways, the idea is you take a leap of faith. So sometimes when we're analyzing and talking about mediation, it could even, I'm assuming that some of this could actually upset people. Except students of religion or scholars in religion, and including, I think theologians are not upset in general, but a lot of theologians are kind of do some, but it's other people can tend to be, because it goes beyond the feeling tone. And also, if a person is relying on spirituality for their own recovery and they're asked to think about these things, it can be something that could potentially, or they could feel subjectively, could shake their foundation. And if it shakes someone up, they don't like it. There are also people in AA that say they like to comfort the disturbed and disturb the comfortable. So, there's a lot of, anyway, I'll go on, but it's just, the next mediator is post-traumatic growth. And this is through a student, one of the students of mine, a former student, M.R. Powang. And she's studied, along with other people, this phenomenon when someone's exposed to traumatic situations, that, you can develop post-traumatic symptoms of various kinds. So, for example, someone who's been involved in a lot of in violent situations, seen violent situations, certain loud noises, right, that sound like a violent situation, you could have a startle response. If you're shown photos of violent situations, you won't want to look at them. You can start becoming avoidant, all the post-traumatic stress types of reactions. Well, there's another phenomena that can happen that's different. It's post-traumatic growth. That one somehow can transform the way they view the world, that instead that life becomes more precious to them after the traumatic event, where they feel glad that they're alive, they feel very grateful for being alive, and that they a greater sense of purpose as opposed to less of a sense. They feel greater sense, an appreciation for possibilities in life. So it's synonymous with stress-related growth. probably Viktor Frankl, and was it God in Search of Man, in talking about his experiences in Nazi concentration camps, would be an example of post-traumatic growth, or an earlier example of writings of something related to post-traumatic growth. 6 is strengthening reliance on executive cognitive processes. And the idea here is there are another former student of mine, David Black, does mindfulness research. He was a co-author on this paper as well as was M and some other folks. But they talk about they say meditation, he talks about meditation in a secular way. You know, mindfulness. They say it's not necessarily a spiritual experience. It is a certain deliberate experience where you pay attention to the present moment, watch thoughts flow through. You clean out your scripts that are going on. And from that you increase firing in your executive processing areas, your neocortical areas. You decrease firing in the amygdala, and it's basically, he thinks about it in a very secular way. But it can lead to, for some people, if you can do it, it goes through feelings of calm, relaxation, and wholeness, and that maybe that's what's mediating the relationship between spirituality and substance use. Is that a reliance on being involved in meditation experiences, just like its analogy with prayer is the idea of talking with two sides of your brain, in a sense. It's a kind of inner speech. 7th one is simply provision of social support. When you're involved in a spiritual program, you might make friends with people there, and if you make friends with folks, you feel you bond with these other people, and you all share a similar thing. You're trying to protect each other. They'll talk about people in recovery. They'll say, "Oh, you can hang out with us on this occasion. We're safe. We're safe people," which means we don't drink or use either. You can we'll be strong together. And that could be a mediator. 8th is just learning adaptive coping. That elements of self-control, learning how to the person can learn how to not be confrontative in situations where don't sweat the small stuff. They can learn to self-monitor, self-regulate, self-acceptance or other acceptance. So adaptive coping could also be a potential mediator. A 9th one is the idea of, how about this one? A generation of a placebo effect. So you all know that whenever, if you believe in something, it's going to work. If I say right now, I'm going to say a prayer for you, and this is going to decrease whatever muscle pain you have right now. And for this prayer, okay, prayer's over. If any of you felt a decrease, I was certainly convincing, wasn't I? Did anyone get a prayer? I talk in monotone, and I pray in monotone. So did anyone experience a decrease in muscle pain? No? Okay, well, not. Let me try it again. No, but if you believed in me, that, and your mu opioid levels, right? Because this from the literature now, recently, your mu opioid levels will tend to increase. And you will feel less pain because the endogenous neurotransmitters, endogenous ligands are operating. And that so if someone believes in a higher power, they pray to God or whatever, they bring God into their heart, they bring Christ into their heart, then what's also could be happening is they will feel an increase in mu opioid levels. If they really believe it, you got to really believe it, you will increase the mu opioid levels and you will feel less pain, subjective pain. And that's a placebo effect, but a placebo effect is it doesn't mean a fake effect. It means it's not an effect for the reasons it's not necessarily the case that Christ is actually entering. Okay, here's my own bias and difficulty on this, which can be, I don't know if it's blasphemous or not. They haven't invented a Gaudometer yet. So this is what I'll also say when I do this thing. You know the Gaudometer? So it's this box, and you have a dial on it. And you carry it around, and when you're looking for the presence of God, when God is present, you go beep, 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 so it's like, okay, God is here. God can take a seat, and so that's kind of the Gaudometer. And as a logical positivist, you want to have a Gaudometer around. And if you don't have otherwise it's a leap of faith. And so that's where, that's where there can be some, it can be problematic. So if they demand a Gaudometer, it's going to be really difficult. So can you imagine you go to Esperanza and they say, I'd like to let Christ into my heart, but how do I know Christ is in there? How can I measure it through an objective measurement? There is no Gaudometer. How do I know? It's not the way it works. So it's okay. But, all right. Okay, now secular-based recovery. I'm not going to talk about, let's see, I'm talking too much. But let's see if I can talk about a little bit about secular. Am I talking too much?
No, it's okay.
Okay. Let me talk about secular-based recovery. Okay, there are a whole variety of recovery organizations. There are the Quad A's, Atheists and Agnostics and Alcoholics Anonymous, and we agnostics and there's a book called the Secular 12 Steps, and there's things that they use, but sometimes they may talk about, I don't know. There may be sometimes they'll talk in spiritual, they'll say this is spiritual, and sometimes they won't. But basically that exists. There's also rational recovery. Anyone in here familiar with rational recovery? Okay. They've had a lot of fighting with, how many people in here are familiar with Alcoholics Anonymous? I should have asked that at the beginning. How many people are not familiar with Alcoholics Anonymous? Not familiar? Okay. Well, there's Alcoholics Anonymous they had a list of 12 steps, and I'll show you what they are, I guess, basically, and there's about 2 million members or something more, I guess, than that now, and it's the 12 steps ideology has permeated probably 2/3 of all recovery treatment in the United States. It's kind of a formalized mechanism. They have 12 steps, and they also bring in some cognitive behavioral. They'll bring in other stuff, but it's very much the foundation. It's not the foundation of recovery like in Spain. It's different. It's much less. There's in other locations it's much smaller, much less involvement. But throughout and not in all states. But it's not as strong, but it tends to be the main kind of recovery and then there's reactions against or supplemental to Alcoholics Anonymous, which say in Alcoholics Anonymous is very much the idea of a spiritual solution. I think there's a fairly strong Alcoholics Anonymous presence in Mexico as well. The groups in Alcoholics Anonymous, for example, in Southern California, when people meet they have like general service office meetings. The meetings are done in English, and nowadays they do them in English and Spanish. So they try to do them. This is there's a pretty strong presence in the Americas. Okay, but rational recovery was invented by it was begun by someone named Jack Trimpe, and without going into a whole lot of detail, the idea is that there's a good part of the brain, a bad part. There's a part of the brain called the beast, which is the primitive brain that wants to run amok, and there's the rational part of the brain that is more deliberate and logical. and that what a rational recovery, in a sense, attempts to do is to strengthen the rational part of the brain and ignore or disrespect the beast part of the brain. There are some other, and it was based in part on rational emotive therapy, which was a certain, dealt with a lot, with certain logical, which are called cognitive structures. Albert Ellis is the person who founded that. That's one. There's groups called secular organizations for sobriety, which transformed into a group called Lifering. And Lifering is a little different. Lifering also says there's a sober self and there's kind of the addict self, and someone else has a sober self and they have an addict self. And when you bring two people together, they can act so that they're two addict selves are interacting, or it could be the two sober selves. And if you can align them so the two sober selves are together, you get a stronger linkage. But the idea, prima facie, is a secular notion. Another one is smart recovery, that began in La Jolla, California. A lot of stuff happens in San Diego for some reason, the idea there is more of adaptive coping. Is that people who have problem with any number of addictions haven't learned how to cope successfully, and that and another one, and then there also have any of you heard of contingency management? So for in at UCLA, they have, like, for people who are heroin addicts or crack addicts, I guess they'll make use of contingency management protocols. So, like with heroin addicts, they go in, they make they can get they can get benefits, but based on their behavior. They do random blood tests, blood samples or urine samples, to check to see if they've been clean. And then so things are tried to shape their life is kind of shaped based on their performance. If they, and so if they perform poorly, positive reinforcements might be removed. If they perform better, positive reinforcements would be added. But it's basically based on their behavior, which is kind of like a 1984 Big Brother, or can be notion in certain ways, but it's considered secular, or people would consider it secular. Okay, so in summary, secular-based recovery can involve, the idea of rational self-direction, very much the person logically making good decisions for themselves, which runs contrary in Alcoholics Anonymous and recovery organizations. They say, people will say, oh, my best thinking is what got me into trouble. So, but in a rational recovery, they say, well, that wasn't your best thinking. Your best thinking will keep you out of trouble. And then they go to court and stuff. And the rational recovery, the relations aren't very good in there. And Lifering says, we have no problem with people being in AA, but you can do this too, or you could do this instead, and they stay out of controversy. Then there's, and I mentioned adaptive coping, resistance to more primitive aspects of self, a real assertion on self-reliance. There may be ability to kind of mutual reliance as well, but there's very much the idea on reliance on self. There is some information in the AA literature which seems contrary to other aspects. It says that their higher power, they said at the bottom line, the higher power resides inside ourselves, deep inside ourselves, which seems to run contrary to other, but it's in there. There's processing of empirical information, like the benefits and costs of drug misuse, which is part of motivational interviewing. The secular approaches may discourage self-labeling, so the person doesn't have to call themselves an alcoholic or an addict. They can say they had Now, some people will call themselves, in rational recovery, they'll call themselves, instead of saying they're in recovery, they'll say they're recovered. They were, in some secular approaches, say they were a recovered alcoholic, for example. And word is a word. But I would say to them, well, I guess since you're recovered, you can go drink again. It's no problem, right? I mean, if you're recovered, doesn't that mean you can, and so it's the way language is used. So they probably mean something else by that, I think, because the ability of someone to drink or use again after they've been in recovery it's not 0%, but it's like maybe 5%, 7%. It's very low. And it's usually people who have not had legal problems. They don't have a massive personality change when they use. They tend to use lower amounts usually. So there's a couple of guideposts but okay, at any rate, a supreme being, a God, is not invoked in secular approaches, and the idea is self-integration. You're trying to integrate self. Self-other integration can be involved, mutual support, but it's mainly more of an emphasis on self. Okay, if we can differentiate between secular approaches and spiritual approaches, and I'm arguing maybe we can, then maybe spirituality, for example, if we say it's attempts at transcendence from self, connection to this higher power to relieve, anxiety and feel good about self and others, feel connected, that maybe that could impact secular variables, attempts at self-integration. You feel more, you feel together, balanced. That impact recovery, but then you could also argue that secular variables can impact one's spirituality. That attempts at self-integration might make one feel transcendent, and so you could kind of reverse. That if these are separable variables, it's possible to test for that. Okay. Okay. Context is important, and that's part of this whole talk is the importance of context. That. And in fact, if like the Church of Spiritual Enlightenment, or the Rastafarian Church, their drugs are very important as a means to achieve a spiritual experience. So you're supposed to use either marijuana, or you're supposed to use peyote in order to. And in fact, there have been some, at one point, the one treatment suggestion in the 1960s was to use peyote as a means to heal from alcoholism, to obtain a spiritual experience and abstain from alcoholism. So the idea is that drug use per se can be considered spiritual. You can measure it. We did a study, and then it's like to achieve my higher self, I use drugs to achieve transcendence, to achieve my higher self. You can envision creating a questionnaire that deals with, you call it pro-drug use spirituality, which might not apply to all drugs and tends to apply more to hallucinogens, but okay. Now, some modern terrorism, Satanism, cult, suicides, paganism, other phenomena arguably could be said to reflect the operation of spirituality of sorts within unique contexts. And then you could say, well, that's not real spirituality, or that's you're appealing to the dark side, or but arguably it is a form of, and that's the danger of having a place. The danger of having a placeholder like spirituality is you don't know what goes in it. And one potential danger that's a very good thing. One potential danger of a place like Esperanza would be having a charismatic leader or someone who's charismatic who tells people what to think and says, well, that's the word of Christ, and then that's really their word, right? And then they think, and that's where you can get, that is what the spirituality is to the person that they're receiving it as, and that could be, potential danger. That's where we get to the point of cults and cultism and all that. Okay, so you can also, so how do we get clarification? I'm almost done. And then you can open up for questions, or maybe I've tired you out and you won't have any questions. But no. The spirituality is a theoretical. We can deal with. There's a couple of notions. One is Wittgenstein, and Wittgenstein was a famous philosopher who wrote books about family resemblances while he was fighting in the trenches in World War I. He'd sit in the trench with his fighting going on, and he'd write apparently he did his works, but he talked about how sometimes what you have essentially is, a psychologist, Eleanor Roche, utilized his ideas in psychology. He talked about birds. For example, she'd say, to what degree is a robin a bird? How about, how is an ostrich a bird? And some people think some birds are more bird-like than other birds, and if you call something a disease or not a disease, there's some agreement and disagreement, and so you talk about different elements or constituents that might represent it. So it's possible, in terms of family resemblance notion, to have people be talking about someone is spiritual, and they could be talking about totally different features. But this is a way you can study. For example, let's say we had these 6 characteristics. Is spirituality is a theoretical construct, and let's say we say it's a matter of existential meaning, grounding or integration, transcendence, a sense of mission, sense of awe, sense of connectedness. Person A may say, I'm spiritual, I really have a sense of existential meaning, of an idea on what the mystery of creation is about, and I also have a sense of wholeness. I feel a sense of wholeness. Person B may say, well, I feel a real mission or destiny in my life, and I feel a sense of reaching beyond myself to a hidden world. Okay, now if those are separable features, if each of those 6 features are separable, then person A could have features 1 and 2, person B could have features 3 and 4. They share no features in common, but they could both be said to be spiritual people. And so that's one thing that we'd want to study. At least you want to gather together what are the likely elements, can we operationalize them, and then can we, if we studied them from a perspective of family resemblances, can that help us maybe to build up a taxonomy or of sorts of different types of spirituality, or something that would then permit a rule-based formulation or a more causal model type formulation. You can also talk about spirituality as having necessary and sufficient conditions, and maybe necessary could be search for transcendence, and sufficient where you have to get that transcendence or you haven't had your spiritual experience. From this point, I can either stop or I can go on to AA stuff.
Maybe if there are any questions. Si hay preguntas o comentarios, los tomamos ahorita. Si no, podemos continuar.
What do you prefer? Because I have a lot of questions and commentaries, but I don't know if you would prefer to wait till the end.
Whatever you'd like. Up to you.
Pues sigamos con los comentarios. Bueno, por lo pronto, si alguien tiene comentarios, preguntas, pueden hacerlos en español despacio o en inglés, como prefieren. Si
Yo.
If you, anyone have any gut reactions? No?
I have got reactions and questions and comments.
Okay, okay.
No? Okay, so I have one general question that will be, what would you consider spirituality to be from a psychological point of view? I mean, will it be like an attitude, like a cognitive stance, or what sort of psychological thing will it be? And my other question is related to the first one is, you were telling about these 9 possible mediators. So why thinking of those in terms of mediation and not in terms of maybe part of a latent variable, latent construct of which spirituality will also be part? Or also, what would you propose that spirituality goes first and then go the other nine elements? So maybe there will be a thing of reverse causation where you first have a change in, I don't know, general attitude or, about living and about oneself, and then spirituality comes from that.
Okay, well, regarding the first question, in terms of as a psychological variable, I mean, depending on your training, you can view it from, the main point. I mean, my training was in psychology, so my bias in thinking about it will tend to be to ask people questions, and then to derive. But you can, you can view spirituality at a social level, which also could be a social psychological level, or you could do social network analysis, and you could raise the question: if 2 people who know each other both are saying that they're spiritual in a social context, then you'd say there's some spirituality going on. But for people where they say they're spiritual, but their friends or their spiritual connections are not being spiritual, you'd say that's not really spirituality, or it's only individual level or spirituality going on. So it's possible to think about spirituality at a social level. You could say there are cultures that are more spiritual oriented than other cultures. But part of it is just how do you measure it? How do you get a sense that you're talking about something that you can talk about with, that you can label and it stands for something behind the label. And I think it's trying to remove some of the vagueness from the construct where I'm at. So that's kind of the first I know that. And so the measurement of spirituality, usually look at one of these 4 things seems to be what people look at. And the people who measure this by training, for this are people in the scientific study of religion. There are psychologists, sociologists, psychiatrists, researchers who tend to, but not every. I mean, there might be other ways, other types of measurement that people just haven't done. I don't know if that answered your question, or if you actually have something you want to say on top. I mean, if you think that I'm measuring spirituality too narrowly, or thinking about it too narrowly.
No, I just wanted to know what you think about it, because the most questionnaires I have seen about the spirituality are like oriented towards attitudes, or something that seems like attitudes. What do you think about something, and how do you feel about something? So
that would be probably, it sounds more like either the first type of measure or the 4th type of measure. Whereas you could also look at the second type of measure, which, doing things, participation, and when people have done some research in Alcoholics Anonymous, they find that attending AA meetings is a better predictor of recovery than attitudes about spirituality, which is curious. Both could be said to be, part of spirituality. There are different types of measures, and the best bet is when you're trying to measure an attitude or you know, when you're trying to measure a construct, the more types of ways you can measure it, the better, to kind of gauge at it, to be able to look at it from different perspectives. But
Yeah, and the reason I think it's related to my second question is because if you are measuring it in terms of 1 and 4, and attitudes, and etc., you have always this problem of endogeneity in attitude variables. When someone is answering something about one variable, that's related to how they answer in another variable. So measuring mediation, and it becomes very complicated.
it can, in order to do it right. Well, in order to do it right, you need at least 3. I mean, to do it really right, people violate this all the time. But you need 3 waves of measurement. People say you need 3 waves of measurement. Use something like structural equation modeling. Have 3 indicators of each of your constructs. Measure your constructs. Like here, you'd want to measure all 3 constructs at 3 time points. You'd want to control for, so for here, what you'd want to do is you want to measure, you have spirituality, let's say controlling for, sense of morality. So you'd want to have, at time 1, you measure morality, spirituality, drug use. Time 2, you measure the same 3 constructs. Time 3, and then you could compose different models, and then you can ask the question, what's causing what, or are they differentiable? Are they discriminant in the questionnaire? So you can look for discriminant validity of the constructs. And you could find, well, you know, morality is spirituality, they're the same thing. Now, however, if you say morality is spirituality, there's a lot of people that would feel upset, though, too. They say, no, it's not. That's not what spirituality is. You know, it's, you know. I mean, yeah, God can teach me what right and wrong is. You know, read the Bible. It says, you know, don't, you know, there's 10 commandments, but that's only part of, you know. So, but you're right. It gets complicated, and presenting this material, the 9 mediators, is kind of a heuristic to encourage people to do that kind of investigation. My question to you is, how many investigations have there been to try to, 1, operationalize spirituality, and 2, test for mediation or deal with that? And I think it's not many. I mean, very few people. It's kind of, I think it's probably unpopular, or it's kind of a place that people often don't want you to go. So I think part of it is to encourage research and suggest that this may be a model. But I totally agree with you that it's complicated, that we don't know, that maybe you take all 9 constructs together and they're all different aspects of spirituality. Are they separable? My own view, with morality of drug use and the spiritualities we measured it, they're separable. They're not the same. You know, and with alternative high school youth, when we did that study, they're not the same construct. I mean, you know, empirically, the kids are responding different ways. So at least in that group, in that sample, you know, like 600 youth or whatever, they're responding in different ways to the 2 constructs, which suggests that they're separable. But yeah, I mean, it is difficult. And then in terms of, could you test a model where spirituality is, in a sense, the mediator? So you say a person has strong morality, sense of morality, but yet they're using drugs. There's someone, and there are people that say, I don't understand, it's wrong, but I do it anyway. What's wrong with me? And they say, well, you don't have a sense of interconnectedness, or you don't have, so you need to, whatever the measures, you know, take Christ into your life, into your heart, take Christ into your heart, and then, you know, and when they do that, they say, wow, now my sense of morality can impact on my drug use. And so you could argue for test alternative models. You could say there could be reverse causation or indirect causation. Also, the main point is it testable? You know, and you'd want to go about looking at alternative models or raising. So I mean, I agree with you that you'd want to look at that. I don't know if it's in the paper or not. Maybe not. I don't know. But yeah.
Well, I'm gonna try to make my questions in English. I have 2 questions. One is regarding the link between religiosity and spirituality during the addiction treatment, because some authors they discuss these both terms regarding religiosity in one hand and spirituality in the other hand. And in the case of rehabilitation centers here in Chile, they make the distinction between religiosity and spirituality is with the secular-based recovery centers. The secular-based recovery centers, they use more the term of spirituality, and the other ones, the ones that they have a religion on them, they use the sense of religiosity. And the other question is regarding the evolution of the 12 Steps program, regarding the figure of the higher power. Because the figure, I read in some article that the figure of the higher power is the one that prevented that AA become a religion. Because on the invisibilization or hiding of the higher power, or not the higher power, the figure of God, with the term of higher power, is what prevented that AA become the religion. So you can tell us about the evolution of the 12 Steps program regarding this figure of the higher power.
Okay. Yeah, there are a couple of articles that discuss the relationship between I don't know if religion or religiosity and spirituality. And Cass does that. There's a couple of different conceptions. One is that spirituality is a subset of religiosity, where the idea is that spirituality involves one's personal religion and involves connection with a higher power that's generally referred to as a God or, absolute knowledge. And that's one perspective that a lot of people do use. There's another one where religion, that spirituality is not a subset of religion, but where religion is a subset of spirituality, where spirituality can refer to all sorts of stuff. And then there's people who argue both ways. So there's no real, there's controversy regarding where the relationship between spirituality and religiosity. Cass and others would argue that I think that spirituality is like a subset of religion, or one's personal religion. But he says as soon as you stay away from things like transcendence or talking about connectedness to some kind of a higher power, that you're then talking about anything. And other people have talked about, for example, the World Health Organization talks about spirituality as, but the idea is, in Cass, let me go back 2 steps, the idea of search for the sacred, ultimate meanings, that according to that has to be something very much involved in spirituality. The problem on the other side is the notion of wellness, of like sense of coherence. If the World Health Organization, when they're talking about spirituality as being a dimension of health, they may be talking about basically having a positive experience of life, positive attitude, and have a kind of a feeling of connectedness with other people. Basically, then it becomes hard to differentiate spirituality from mental health. And then what happens is when people are measuring spirituality, they're measuring just, basically they end up measuring mental health, and they're not measuring something else. So part of the problem is, where do you separate these conceptual entities? So that's where the debate is, and there's no answer to it. There's no absolute there. So that's part of your question. In terms of AA, Jim Thirlwell, he played an instrumental role in some of the 12 steps, and I'll go over what the 12 steps are, but he probably was very instrumental in keeping AA from becoming a religion because he's one of the first 10 members. He's very much involved in some of the 12 steps, and he's an atheist. I don't know if he would say that he's spiritual or not. But again, as soon as you use the term spiritual, you know, if I go ahead, I'd have to then ask you, what do you mean when you use the word spiritual?
Yeah, well, it doesn't have, it's linked with the notion of religiosity, but it doesn't, no se agota, y cómo puedo decir eso, you know,
It's not just that.
See, it's not just that. Religiosity or spirituality is more, to me, is more like regarding the religion experience of each person.
Okay, and it could say it's that search for what underlies existence, that a feeling of a specialness, quality that's spiritual, you would sacred, that is something special. If I have an object, well, in the middle of the desert, this bottle of water can become sacred, you know, but it's context dependent. But do you treat it with almost, I hate to use the word magical, but kind of magical qualities? Have you ever had an object that you think is just very, very special? You know, it's something other than, that could be, you know, you give it give it sacred qualities. And that could be something that you could not necessarily be part of a formalized religion, but something that you treat as sacred, that could be maybe part of spirit. I think that's what people are trying to intend on when they're trying to discriminate spirituality from non-spiritual kinds of things. That sort of essence. But again, you could define spirituality as meaning all sorts of things, including various wellness notions, and then, again, but then we have the problem of that which explains everything, explains nothing. So if religion is part of spirituality, if spirituality is much more, can spirituality be something that doesn't involve searching for some kind of higher power entity? Then the next thing the other question you said is okay, higher power in AA, what does higher power mean?
Yeah.
Okay, so here is, now I'm breaking their anonymity. They're dead. They don't care. By the way, as an aside, why not? Is this a terrible thing to... Well, Bill W., you know, when LSD was created on the market, Bill W. was one of the experimenters in the AA Central Office. He was one of the experimenters of LSD. In fact, he used it for 3 years, while he was also sober from alcohol and one of the kind of the icons in AA. So people in AA, they said, Bill, you got to quit the acid. You got to get off this stuff. He goes, no, I'm going to quit. I'm going to leave AA. I really like it. You know, I'm using it to push my ego to the side and help me really connect to a higher power. And I got to get rid, I got to get the ego out of the way. And so they said, Bill, whether you like it or not, you're an icon of Alcoholics Anonymous, so you have to quit the acid, you know. And he did. So he made a choice and he quit the acid after 3 years. And there are people who find spiritual solutions, but one thing that happens is when people become leaders of organizations, we also tend to treat them with special qualities. We sometimes endow them with, we call them sacred. So Bill and Bob, in a sense, have become sacred, and they had a lot of flaws. And of course, they both died of smoking-related disease, the kind of number one killer. And you know that, people in recovery, in the United States, about 60% are regular cigarette smokers. So they don't totally, which also then makes recovery difficult for people in recovery who are non-cigarette smokers, who don't want to be around it. And then that's another thing that can become difficult, and they have to kind of orchestrate. There are a lot of non-smoker meetings now. And so there's, things have changed that way. But I noticed that last Esperanza, there is no tobacco use. So it's real easy there. in terms of that. But anyway, okay. So, and there's Jimmy Kinnan, who started Narcotics Anonymous. He looks happy. Let me, I don't know if I should talk about the AA constructs or just let me go into the 12 steps to go back to this question and go. So the idea, this kind of combines like AA and any kind of addiction, okay? So it's not the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous, okay? So then they use the word we a lot. So it means it's not a program, it's not an I program. So they say they have to admit they're powerless over the addiction, their lives have become unmanageable. And interestingly enough, I have the first book that was published, well, not the first, but the second book really on behavioral addictions. And they talk about, these are all, researchers, but they basically use the first step of AA. Trust program to define when the behavior is an addiction, which is curious. But then they say we became to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity, made a decision to turn our will and lives over to the care of God as we understood them. So God's name, the name God is used, which the quades, the alcoholics and agnostics atheists and agnostics in AA have problems with that part. So they will change that language. Why did AA not become a religion? Well, as we understood him, and I think as we understood him might have been what Jim Thirlwell added in there. The original group of Alcoholics Anonymous people, they got down on their knees. They gathered at the houses and they were down on their knees. Okay? I mean, they were a combination of people. Roman Catholics, Episcopalians. I don't know if there were evangelicals in the original group, but, it is basically 99 men and 1 woman. Things have changed, but so there was there's also probably initially a gender bias, but anyway, okay. So it is curious that we admitted to God, ourselves, and to another human being the exact nature of our wrongs. We're entirely ready to have God remove all these defects of character. So you'll see that there are three of the steps. There is the word God used in there, which is also used interchangeably with higher power, which and then results in a spiritual awakening. So from that sense, you could say it's questionable but the out clause, the Jim Thirlwell clause, as we understood him, which doesn't, God could mean good orderly direction. If it's good orderly direction, and that's basically the God entity, you admit it to your sense of good orderly direction to ourselves and other human beings. So you understand. So you can go that way. So then it could bypass being treated as a religion. And the organization of AA, that's there are something called the 12 traditions and the 12 concepts. Or particularly the organization, keep it. It's not a religious organization per se. I mean, there's no, but there are meta-religious. The big book is a blue book, and it has some qualities like that. But I don't know what percentage of people in AA are atheists and agnostics, though. So I don't know if does that kind of address.
Yeah.
So it's other questions and yeah.
Perdón, nada más antes quería aclarar, puesto que no todo mundo recibe los correos del seminario, si quieren recibir el artículo que estamos discutiendo hoy del profesor Sussman, o también para quienes nos están escuchando en línea, que escriban a la dirección del seminario, seminario csr@colef.mx. Les enviamos el artículo y por supuesto ahí también encontrarán la bibliografía que está refiriendo el profesor Sussman.
Yeah, my email address is, I have a card. If you want my card, I have my cards. I'll give you my email addresses. Be glad to send you the PDF of the article, or you can email me and I respond right away. So.
Gracias. Bueno, otra aclaración, Steve se ha referido varias veces a la esperanza. Quien no está familiarizado, la esperanza es uno de los lugares en los que hemos estado haciendo trabajo de campo. Well, my question is about, there are some theoretical proposals about different neurological difference between the men and women brain, and how these differences are related with the recovery process. I don't know if, what do you think about it?
Well, while I'm an expert on everything,
Do you think that gender
I don't know. I think you know that literature better than I do. I don't. But what I'd ask you is you have my email address. If you have a relevant article, send it to me, educate me, and I'd be glad to discuss it with you. I don't know.
Okay.
It's a good question.
Okay, thank you.
Sí, Olga, adelante.
It is the case that, I mean, you all know that, prevalence or observed prevalence of drug misuse, of drug abuse problems are like 2-to-1 to 4-to-1 ratio of males versus females. To some extent, that's females being less likely to self-disclose about having drug problems, and to some extent, it may just be very, maybe societal influences being stronger for females to be, females are more discouraged from using drugs to be, to be a good girl, as in guys, go out there and, sow the wild oats more, maybe. And then, but of people who do have drug problems, the literature that I've looked at says females die more quickly, and the outcomes prognosis is worse. And so that's curious. Is it lower body weight, or other in terms of neurobiological differences? I don't know. I should know, but yeah, please.
Well, I'm going to try to make my question in English too, but if I'm not fine, I'm going to say it in Spanish. Where if we understand the addiction as a loss of control of a consume or consume of a substance, the treatment is focused on the recovery of that control, and it can be put, the control locus can be placed outside in God, in a high power, or in the acceptance of the others. But in another way, it can be put inside of the person in the develop of skills, or in a cognitive treatment, changing irrational ideas, maybe more centered in a psychological intervention. But my question is, in the spiritual-based treatments, where it tends more to locus the control outside or inside? Maybe it can be a combination of both, and maybe it depends on how the groups understand or work with spirituality. But in your experience, where is placed that control more in the spiritual-based treatments?
You mean, is the control more in self versus others?
Inside or outside of the person?
I think, you know what, I have an opinion, and I think my opinion is that I think that there's probably is a consensus. My opinion is that there is a consensus in a sense, and that the consensus is that initially when a person first goes into recovery, the source is from the outside, because they're a mess. I mean, depending on their bottom, unless they're, if the person is a binger, they're a temporary mess, and then they set up for the next cycle, for the next binge. So one thing is that we're dealing with all sorts of different nuts and bolts, all sorts of different people with all sorts of different patterns of use. But if you're talking about a person who's like a regular user, by the time who hits a low bottom, life is a mess. There's nothing to rely on in a sense, and it is true that their best thinking when they're in the midst of the addiction is the best, and it is very good thing. It's very resourceful thinking. If you're down on your cash, you have to figure out a way to score. And you have to be very creative because you don't have any. How are you gonna? If your connections are how you go to higher bottom, your connections have run dry. How are you going to generate a new connection? And you want to stay out of trouble. When you want to go ahead and you want to buy your drug of choice, you don't want to get hurt, and you have to have a means of exchange. So you have to know where it's sold. You have to know how to make it a polite enough conversation to score. You've got to have means of exchange. You've got to find a place to use it so you don't get caught. You've got to be able to maximize the quality of your experience, maybe. So that takes a lot of planning. And so it does take some of the best thinking in a way. I mean, if you think about it in a different way, people in the midst of their addiction, they're not stupid. They're just, they're doing something that's killing themselves. Yeah, okay. But yeah, when a person goes to treatment, all of the thinking is in one direction, and sometimes they go to treatment after. One person that we talked to the other day at Esperanza, he was dead for a couple minutes. So his bottom, or the time he decided to stop, was he was dead, and he woke up and there were a bunch of bodies around him. And he said, he got the idea that maybe this wasn't a good idea, and he felt like he was at the end of his rope. He said he stepped on the street. I think he'd be okay with me. I won't say who he stepped on the street and a car ran over his foot. He says, and he was thinking of using. Again, a car ran over his foot. He's going, the gig was up. He felt the gig was really up, but he couldn't really rely on himself in a sense, because that was where he knew that it seemed things outside of him were guiding him. He had to go elsewhere. After people get a certain amount of, so for a lot of folks, they'd say the solution has to be some kind of displacement of what everything in them is dedicated doing, what they've become an expert on, to totally something else. And that something else, it could be something that they used to do, the way they used to be, but that would be, how do you strengthen that when you've got so many, automatic, thinking to use again. In terms of implicit cognition terms, how many of you have been to this lecture hall before, this particular room? How many of you have been to this room a lot of times? Okay, did you have to think about how to get to this room, or did you automatically just come here? Did you think about it? Now I've got to turn left and I got to turn right? No? Okay, so that your implicit cognition, your associative memory, implicit cognition, and connections to motor memory is all set up. Serves a wonderful economic function. And if you're a drug addict, you've been using a long time, everything's all packaged in, you don't have to think about how to get to the room as much. So there's a tendency at the beginning you need to rely on something outside of yourself. And then eventually the idea is the person, as they learn more and more, everything becomes internalized. So for even the atheist in Alcoholics Anonymous, Jim Thirlwell, he said he relied on his group initially, and then over time he relied on his better self. He called it his better self. So even though he said he didn't believe in God or he questioned the existence of God, he did rely on something outside of himself initially, and then he relied on something inside himself. If a person is a binger, I think it might be possible for them to rely on their better self earlier, because they have periods of time, they know what it's like to walk the terrain of sobriety, and they say, okay, they can go back, then they have to practice it, like getting into shape again in exercising. And then maybe they could, so they could rely on themselves or their in modern learning theory, what people would say is you need, for someone to maintain a certain pattern of behavior, it helps to obtain with saturated reward if they live in a world of free operants, which means that they have all sorts of contingencies, all sorts of different ways they can operate. They'll operate on the one that gives them the most goodies, sometimes sooner. And of course, then people talk about addicts as having different brains, where they rely more on immediacy, of reinforcement, and they have more problems delaying. And I don't know. Anyway, so it's okay. Let me stop at that one because it's complicated. I can go on, and I like this cartoon too. So other, I don't know if I answered it at all. So probably initially social, and then later individual. But if you're a binger, maybe it could be either. Depends on the person. Depends on the context. And it's certainly nice to be in a situation where the person feels good. I mean, if they're connected to a group and they're getting a lot of goodies, good feelings for being sober, and they don't want to use because they're just, it's not what people do in the group. They do things that, and they're having fun. That's a wonderful thing. I have seen people, in my experience, I've seen people who claim to be very spiritual people, meditate, are involved in groups, and they seem really at ease with themselves. I've seen them, they seem very non-judgmental. They seem very clear. They're not fighting the world. Their affect is, very kind of peaceful. And I sometimes when I do meet these people, I admire them. But so I mean that I don't. Okay, stop. Next question. Yes.
Okay, so you were talking about how people can be very moral and have an addiction. I immediately thought of a friend who lives on the streets and uses drugs. He's very, very moral and very religious, very Christian. So he's always talking about God. And he's a very iconic figure in terms of intense spirituality, but it's not an exception. On the streets, if you talk to people who are living on the streets and using drugs, you hear about religion about 60% of the time you talk to them. So it's mostly about religion. And people are defining themselves as very spiritual people. So have you done a study in terms of which aspects of spirituality have more impact in recovery than others? Because you told about 6 different parts of spirituality. So are some more powerful than others in terms of being an aid for addiction?
Well, the study that I was most aware of was the one, it was, I think it's Tonigan. If you email me, I can try to find the article for you. I wasn't involved with it. But it was the one where they looked at meeting attendance, AA meeting attendance versus feeling sense of being spiritual or religious. And then they said that it was meeting attendance, so participation in the group was what was predicting sobriety more than belief in a higher power per se. And so if you argue that both of those are elements, different measures of spirituality, then you'd say it would be the group participation. So if you take your friend who's religious but on the streets, and you'd put him into La Esperanza, it'd be being part of Esperanza would be what would keep him sober, being, and you'd also argue he might be a good fit. I mean, depending on how. Now sometimes when people are street smart, they talk religion too, I mean.
Yeah, to get by.
Yeah, if it works, whatever works. And one other thing as an aside, I don't know why I mentioned, y'all know about Philip Seymour Hoffman, who's the Academy Award-winning actor. He played in True. He died. He had a heroin. It was a heroin alcohol overdose. Heroin, yeah. Same thing that killed Jerry Garcia was in the Grateful Dead. He was in recovery at a detox facility in Northern California, and while he was during his stay, he died. But Philip Seymour Hoffman died of an OD, related to heroin and alcohol. You think he had everything, right? But I mean, he had a relationship breakup, But you know how much sobriety he had before he relapsed? I think this is, the problem with celebrities is they don't get much privacy. But he had 22 years of sobriety. So it means someone can get, so you're painting over this implicit cognition or whatever, these other things that are going on, but it will say it's always there a little bit. They may not think about it at all. And part of it will be what environment you put them in. There was what's his name? Keith Monteith, who's the actor from a TV show called Glee. He's a young guy, and he was worried. He said he was worried about his sobriety. He was going back into treatment, and people said, why don't you just get a treatment coach? Why are you going to a recovery center and spend all that money? And in fact, someone interviewed me about that, and I said, well, he's got the money. He could go. So if he's got the money, he could go, and he feels he needed. Maybe he's being a wise consumer. Anyway, he was back up. He went back up to British Columbia, Victoria. He sold stomping grounds, and so what happened. I mean, he overdosed, and then people found out it wasn't. He wasn't playing. He was really into some hard. I guess it was also heroin.
Yeah.
But anyway, yeah. People who are on the street. Then but in terms of components of religion that are important for recovery, or components of spirituality that are important for recovery, I think the obvious answer is being embedded in an environment where people aren't using, or surrounding oneself with other people that aren't using, and avoiding context. If the drugs aren't there, you're not going to use it. If you surround yourself with people who don't use and they're around you all the time. The problem is, like with, there was a drug coach, like someone like I think with more celebrities. There was someone who was like a drug coach for, I guess, Robert Downey Jr., and I think also maybe Whitney Houston for a while. For Robert Downey Jr., it took, and he really transformed, I think, over time. For Whitney Houston, you can't, they had someone, she'd have like someone to be around her 24/7 to make sure she's not using for a while. And then, but you go to the washroom and get other things. You figure out a way. If you're clever, if you're a good planner and you're a clever addict, you figure out a way to, people can't watch you all the time. You figure out a way to use, and So when she figured out somehow, she, the metaphorical sick joke is she needed one more hit. And and had heart disease, so had probably, I guess it was probably left coronary thrombosis, which is what'll tend to kill a lot of aging crack addicts, probably. But okay, at any rate, but I don't know if that. Now I'm kind of.
Yeah.
But is your friend religious, or does he use it to his advantage, or does he?
No, he is religious.
Does he incorporate drug use as part of the religion? Does he feel shame that he uses drugs?
Yes, he cries.
What does he use every day, all the time?
It varies. From time to time, he doesn't use drug. He uses alcohol, and sometimes he uses every day, and sometimes he quits for short period of time, and then he goes back again into drinking.
How long does he quit for?
I think the longest have been 2 months.
Okay. What happens with alcohol is it gets out of your system pretty quickly. He probably does he get into situations where he actually gets scared?
Scared?
Well, has he had various calamities when he's drinking?
Calamities?
He wakes up with someone. So how did he or she get there? And or he has an injury, or he wakes up outside. He wasn't indoors, or he mistreated someone while he was drinking, or he woke up just feeling terrible and had to lie in bed for a full day or a day and a half or 2 days, basically not able really to move or function. Any of those things.
he refers as having sexual misconduct, or he perceives himself as having sexual misconduct, but he's aware of that. He says, I just can't stop. I'm not strong enough to stop.
Okay. And now, Patrick, okay, so see, part of the thing is, okay, the whole thing here is I'm taking you're taking also a nomothetic approach. So a nomothetic grouping people together. When we use statistics, we're grouping people together. And that's very different from an ideographic approach where we're dealing with each individual. So now that we're learning about your friend and, who stay anonymous, and I apologize for even, prying in a sense, but the first question that comes to mind is he someone like Patrick Carnes, so we would call someone who is a sex addict or a love addict, not sure which yet, but probably a sex addict, and an alcoholic who engages what's called alternating intensification, alternating cycles. There's 10 different patterns of addiction that it might use. For example, he may get drunk, and then once he's drunk, he can go ahead and sexually misbehave because he can blame it. Oh, I feel so ashamed, but I was drunk. But would he sexually misbehave if he's not drunk? If he's dry or whatever. So that's one question. Maybe he would. Maybe they both operate. At the end, when he wakes up the next day and he feels all this shame, the question is does a little part of him go, gee, that was fun? I mean,
maybe, but I don't think so. He really feels. I mean, he's a very tall guy, and he just starts crying because he feels so like he's letting God down.
Is he married or have a relationship?
Yes. Yeah. He lived in the United States and then he got deported. His wife is in the United States, and his family, his daughter, and I think he also has a son.
Okay.
But he's here in Ensenada.
Okay. Well, I mean, okay. So let me stop there in terms of answering questions. It gets more complicated. He might do better if he's involved in some kind of a social organization that emphasizes clean living, like does he go to meetings, AA meetings at all? Or? Well, there's also, you have to watch that in AA, there's something called 13th stepping.
No.
You ever heard of 13th stepping? That's when the older, sober AA member hits on especially guys, they hit on the new females that come in, and they kind of take them on, mentor them, and maybe sleep with them. So that's 13. It's not considered a good thing, and they discourage it, but some people do it, and it happens. So it happens. But with your friend, if he's embedded in a group where he gets some of his needs met, social needs met, and then there are other organizations that are growing. The problem with sex addiction is there's so incredibly so much shame that's attached to it, and that people can worry about. They don't want to seek treatment. People really tend to avoid treatment on it until they get into a whole lot of trouble. And then it's also a behavior like eating. You have to eat. You don't have to have sex, but most people, they'll engage in it at least for procreation. But for otherwise, tends to be something that people will do. So, which differs from alcohol, maybe. But anyway, okay. But there's probably a lot more to it, and the simplest way that your friend could deal with it that may or may not be helpful to him, at least for a while, would be what's called a functional analysis. The most immediate thing he can do, since there's no time, would be before he has an episode, before he gets ready to start drinking and using again, what's he thinking? What's he feeling? What are his behaviors? And what's the situation that he's in? When he engages in the drinking and using and he finishes an episode, if he's binging, I don't know how long he uses for. Or does he use continuously, or is it usually short binges?
No, he uses continuously.
Well, then it becomes, So you want to try to get an idea what the precipitating events are, what the maintaining events are. And sometimes, you know, after his first drink or using, you know, what happens, there's, with him, all it takes is starting the engine going. But something happens before he initiates it that where he's at risk. If he has a safety factor, he needs some place that he can go to, something he can do that'll turn it off. It'll turn off the engine. And then he had, you know, then he'd have a chance. But it's almost, you know, probably it's like an engine coming on and he's getting ready to roll. And so you've got to have something to kind of turn it off. He's got to have a place. So that functional analysis can help, but and it helps for if he has something 24/7. There's something he can do. Somebody can call. Can he call you 24/7? You know, that's.
He's not the only homeless friend that I have, and I usually provide.
So okay, we can talk
Okay.
later. We can talk
Yeah.
later. Okay, That's it. Okay, if anyone wants to ask any questions, I'm around for a little bit, so feel free. And remember, I can answer every question you.
Thanks. Muchas gracias a todos, muchas gracias a los participantes, a quienes nos siguen en línea también. Les recordamos que en la página del seminario van a estar anunciándose las siguientes sesiones. La próxima es el 17 de junio. Bueno, en todo caso está en la página del seminario para quienes quieran asistir. Y también les recordamos que quienes quieran estar recibiendo por correo electrónico los avisos de las siguientes sesiones pueden escribirnos para agregarlos a la lista. Pues muchas gracias. Muchas gracias.